Included in the Epstein files are communications between him and a publicist who's known for representing the rich and famous in Hollywood. Matthew Hiltzik has his own PR firm, Hiltzik Strategies, and he's helped defend actors like Johnny Depp and Brad Pitt, politicians like Hillary Clinton, journalists like Katie Couric, and according to invoices in the Epstein files, Jeffrey Epstein in the year 2017. But it's not just the people on his client list who are connected. Hiltzik's PR strategies across these cases have a lot of similarities in common, and they reveal how these elites manage to avoid accountability even when facing allegations of domestic violence and sexual violence. For those outside the world of celebrity PR, you might be hearing the name Matthew Hiltzik for the first time right now. But for those who are well versed in this world of elite celebrity, he's one of the most infamous names out there. Previously, at the end of the 90s, Matthew Hiltzik worked in house at Miramax. That name might be more familiar because it's the film studio for Harvey Weinstein, and Hiltzik at one point served as his spokesperson. He then went on to form his own PR firm where he represented even more A list celebrity names. And during the 2022 defamation trial against his ex wife Amber Heard, Hiltzik steered the reputation of Johnny Depp. Now, when I searched Johnny Depp's name in the Epstein files, I didn't find any direct communications between the two. But when I searched Matthew Hiltzik's name, I found hundreds of files. These communications appeared to start around May 2017, when there were documented calls and emails between Hiltzik and Epstein, like this one. This is an email from Leslie Groff, one of Epstein's executive assistants, and it's an alert for a 4:30 p.m. appointment with Matthew Hiltzik and his then colleague Ben Sicento on May 5th. Then a few days later, there's another alert from Leslie Groff that says there's a 3:30 p.m. call with Matthew Hiltzik on May 8th. These initial calls and meetings led up to this email from then Hiltzik Strategies Chief Operating Officer Ronnie Gross. It says, "Hi, Jeffrey, good to meet you. We'd like to structure our agreement through your attorney, meaning he/she will be hiring Hiltzik to assist them with your case, but you can pay us directly. This provides for stronger attorney-client privilege protection. Please send me your lawyer's full contact info, including the name of the firm, and I will draft an engagement letter for his/her and your review. You and I can discuss fees on Monday, or if you prefer, over the weekend, and we can just fill that in. Thanks, and looking forward to working with you." So, what was going on around this time in 2017 that led Jeffrey Epstein to seek the services of one of the highest profile publicists in the game? Well, Jeffrey Epstein wouldn't really become a household name until 2019, a couple years later, when he was arrested on federal sex trafficking charges. But at this point, he had already been convicted of sexual offenses in 2008. And those allegations were starting to resurface right around this time. Journalists were digging deeper into what had led to that 2008 conviction because one of Epstein's survivors, Virginia Jeffrey, had sued Ghislaine Maxwell for defamation a few years prior. And more information about the connections between Epstein, Maxwell, Prince Andrew, and Donald Trump were starting to come out in those filings. So on May 4th, 2017, literally the day before that meeting with Matthew Hiltzik, Politico published this piece with the headline, "The One Weird Court Case Linking Trump, Clinton, and a Billionaire Pedophile." And here we have a picture of Jeffrey Epstein with Ghislaine Maxwell underneath. This article was linked to that civil defamation suit, which was about to go to trial later in the month. It ended up being settled just a couple of weeks later. But that wasn't the only reason Epstein was in the news around this time. In 2017, Trump had just begun his very first term in office, and his cabinet picks were undergoing their confirmation hearings, including former Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta. Alex Acosta was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida between 2005 and 2009, aka the years in which Epstein was first investigated and eventually convicted. And Acosta was the engineer behind the Sweetheart deal that allowed Epstein to do a 6-day-a-week work release from prison and serve a minuscule term compared to the offenses he was accused of. So in March 2017, the New York Daily News reported that President Trump's labor nominee was facing a grilling during his confirmation hearings over his role in that Jeffrey Epstein plea deal. During those early 2017 confirmation hearings, Senator Tim Kaine asked Acosta about his role in the Epstein case. So there were lots of questions beginning to swirl at the level of the national media about Jeffrey Epstein and members of Trump's administration. And Matthew Hiltzik, the publicist, also had close ties to the Trump administration at this time. Before Trump had ever run for office, Hiltzik represented his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, pictured in this photo with him side by side. Matthew Hiltzik is on the right and Kushner is in the center. Hiltzik had also represented Ivanka Trump. And during Trump's 2016 campaign for president, members of Team Hiltzik represented both Ivanka and Tiffany in some emails. Some of this information was revealed during the probe into whether Russia had interfered with the 2016 election. So Hiltzik had ties to the Trump family, and he also had ties to the journalist and author Michael Wolff, who would go on to write several books about Trump's early candidacy and his first term as president. Michael Wolff appeared to be the initial point of contact between Hiltzik and Epstein, because in the Epstein files, we have this entry for Matthew Hiltzik that describes him as Michael Wolff's friend. And there are also emails from Michael Wolff to Jeffrey Epstein about Hiltzik, including one where Michael Wolff says he can help make the connection and smooth it out. We also know that Michael Wolff enjoyed a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that resembled something like access journalism. Access journalism is when journalists obtain exclusive access to high-profile people and sometimes scoops or other information, but they do so by making sure that their coverage ultimately is in favor to these people in some way. It's a sort of backroom negotiation that can unfortunately give leverage to those people in power instead of what journalists are supposed to do, which is hold powerful people accountable. And we can kind of see the contours of this type of relationship between Michael Wolff and Jeffrey Epstein in the Epstein files. For example, Michael Wolff sent Jeffrey Epstein a passage, a draft of what would later be part of his second book. And this was a passage concerning Epstein directly. So we can see that Michael Wolff sent this draft to Epstein in February 2019. And after Epstein and Hiltzik became acquainted, and after they talked about that agreement with Epstein's lawyer that was described in that previous email, there are 3 invoices in the Epstein files shared with Jeffrey Epstein from Hiltzik's strategies, billing him for $25,000 a month for communications counsel and public relations services rendered on a monthly basis. We have one invoice from the period between June 1st and June 30th, 2017. We have another invoice from July 1st to July 30th. And then we have this third invoice from October 1st to October 31st. So, what exactly was Hiltzik's strategies doing for Epstein during this time? Well, we know that early on in their relationship, Hiltzik brought on a junior publicist, Ben Sasenko, to help him deal with Epstein's case. And in emails between Ben Sasenko and Epstein, we can see how their strategy began to form. For example, in this September 7th, 2017 email from Ben Sasenko to Jeffrey Epstein, he says, "Hi, Jeffrey. Hope that you enjoyed your Labor Day weekend. Matthew and I met today, and we have 2 quick follow-ups for you." He said, "Now that the HuffPost article is back up, we can revisit having Richard Johnson do something. Richard's question from the HuffPost story last week was, 'How much are you donating?'" Then he also said, "Just a nudge to send the list of the first 3 names and contact info of third-party validators so we can start that process." Then in an email a few days later, Sasenko said, "Richard Johnson connected with Mark, who went on the record. Richard said call went great. Item should be in Thursday's paper." At this point in time, Richard Johnson was a reporter for the gossip outlet Page Six, and he covered New York's wealthy elite. Interestingly enough, I couldn't find either a HuffPost article from this time period or a Richard Johnson piece about Epstein. So either those articles have been removed from the internet, they were too difficult to find, or they never ended up actually happening. But in these emails between Epstein and Hiltzik, we can also get a sense of what Epstein's motivations were. For example, he sent this email all the way back in May 2017 with the subject line target audience. And he said his target audience was primarily one, elite New Yorkers, the type of business leaders who he wrote, unfortunately, read page 6, two, Silicon Valley, three, European leaders, and four, academics. We know from the other Epstein files that Epstein had a network of influential people from all of these various industries and areas, and he had various ambitions around these people. For example, in some of his last days, he was talking to Steve Bannon about the ability to see far right leaders ascend in European politics. He also spoke frequently with academics at various colleges and universities around the US, and some of those academics even sent young women in Jeffrey Epstein's direction. And some of these academics were people who privately defended Jeffrey Epstein even after his 2008 conviction, and they were people that Epstein hoped could maybe go on the record to defend him publicly as well. In this email to Matthew Hiltzik in July 2017, he said Noam Chomsky, the famed linguistics professor, is, quote, willing to go out on a limb if there is a benefit. In this September 2017 email chain between Epstein and Hiltzik, they discuss other people who could potentially promote Epstein's charitable activities or his interest in scientific research, including, again, Noam Chomsky, Mark Tramo, and Lawrence Krauss, the AI ethics professor from the University of Arizona. Lawrence Krauss would then go on to face his own sexual misconduct allegations just 1 year later in 2018, and he would email Epstein for advice in combating them. Interestingly enough, Krauss was also close with Johnny Depp as they did a panel talk together at ASU in 2016, and Krauss even recommended at that point that Epstein speak with Johnny Depp, but Epstein turned him down. But nearly 6 years later, Hiltzik would work with Johnny Depp during that 2022 defamation trial against Amber Heard that Johnny Depp ultimately won that trial, and his public reputation absolutely changed over the course of the media assault against Amber Heard. One of the strategies that worked in Johnny Depp's favor at this time was this pseudo-feminist narrative that Depp was the real victim to Heard's domestic abuse. This argument doesn't hold a lot of weight because a previous trial in the UK found numerous credible examples of times that Johnny Depp had physically, emotionally, and sexually abused Amber Heard. But in the US trial, public opinion swayed so far in this direction that a jury ultimately found that Heard had defamed Depp, not even by naming him, but just by writing that she was a survivor of this type of abuse. Interestingly enough, going back to the way that Matthew Hiltzik tried to defend Jeffrey Epstein's reputation, there was also an attempt to craft a pseudo-feminist narrative around the way that Epstein's support had benefited female economists. In this July 2017 email chain, Ben Sasenko from Hiltzik Strategies reaches out to this woman, Barbro Enbom. Barbro Enbom is a Swedish economist, and she reached out to someone connected to Jeffrey Epstein and said, "Who are they?" Jeffrey Epstein then tells Sasenko, "Tell her it is a PR firm that would like to know about my support for female economists and how important that funding is. Do not tell them details of money." So the narrative that Epstein was trying to construct was one where he wasn't a danger to women and girls, but rather that his charitable contributions provided instrumental support for women and girls. This wasn't a narrative that ultimately helped Jeffrey Epstein out very much in the end. It did not stick for him, and just a couple of years later, the whole world found out about the sex trafficking charges against him. But when it comes to Hiltzik's strategies and the publicists who worked under Matthew Hiltzik at this time, this narrative has been more successful for their other clients. Going back to that May 5th meeting with Jeffrey Epstein, Matthew Hiltzik, and Ben Sasenko, there's another email in the Epstein files that initially said Hiltzik would be bringing along his colleague Melissa Nathan as well. Melissa Nathan is perhaps best known today as one of the defendants in Blake Lively's sexual harassment and retaliation lawsuit against her former director and co-star Justin Baldoni. Lively accuses Melissa Nathan, who was working as Baldoni's publicist, of orchestrating a retaliatory smear campaign against her online. Melissa Nathan used to work for Hiltzik Strategies, but she eventually left to start her own firm, the Agency Group, which is what represented Baldoni. And she denies that this meeting between her and Epstein took place, or that she had any knowledge of it, or that she ever would have agreed to meet with someone like Jeffrey Epstein. The way that she issued that denial is very, very interesting because she didn't share it in a statement with the mainstream media. She shared it with a podcaster who has been covering the Lively Baldoni case with an extreme slant in favor of Justin Baldoni and against Blake Lively. Melissa Nathan, through her lawyer Brian Friedman, shared this exclusive statement with a podcaster named Zach Peter, as well as a podcaster named Daily Dose of Dana. They aren't journalists. And in fact, Zach Peter has gained a lot of attention in recent days for spreading baseless conspiracies about the kidnapping of broadcaster Savannah Guthrie's mother. But Melissa Nathan apparently saw fit to release this statement denying any involvement with Jeffrey Epstein through this highly partisan source, ensuring that the only people who would see this were people who were already sympathetic to her and her cause. And so her statement through Brian Friedman says, to be absolutely clear, neither Melissa Nathan nor anyone at TAG has ever met, engaged with, or provided public relations or any type of services for Jeffrey Epstein. Miss Nathan's name was added to the email without her knowledge or approval. She learned of it only when it became public, along with everyone else. Regardless of whether a former firm used her name without her consent, Miss Nathan has never been copied on any email with Jeffrey Epstein, has never communicated in any way with him or any of his associates, and has never attended, nor would she ever agree to attend, a meeting involving him. And there are two things that strike me as interesting about this statement. The first of which is that it's not entirely accurate. There's another publicist who at one point worked for the Agency Group and before that worked for Hiltzik Strategies, who does appear in the Epstein files because when she was working at a third publicity firm, she reached out to Jeffrey Epstein in 2016 to invite him to another client's film premiere. And according to Jeffrey Epstein's executive assistant, he attended with 3 guests. But what really strikes me as the most fascinating thing about this strategy is that it's so similar to the way that Johnny Depp's team worked with new media and alternative media sources during the 2022 defamation trial. Depp's lawyer, Adam Waldman, testified that he had spoken and communicated with and shared information with 3 YouTubers who he referred to as, quote, internet journalists. These 3 YouTubers created highly inflammatory, biased, and misleading information that painted Amber Heard as the villain and the abuser, and Johnny Depp as the victim. Those videos were then viewed by hundreds of millions of people and no doubt contributed to the public's opinion of the case in major ways. That's a strategy that was engineered in tandem with Hiltzik's representation of Johnny Depp. And now this strategy to defend Justin Baldoni is coming from a source who once worked under Matthew Hiltzik. Melissa Nathan isn't the only interesting alumnus of Hiltzik Strategies. Hope Hicks, the former White House communications director and personal spokesperson for Donald Trump, also left her position at Hiltzik Strategies to go work with Trump directly. So my takeaway from all of this is that these publicists use the same tactics time and time again to defend their wealthy, powerful clients, even when they're accused of heinous crimes ranging from domestic violence to sex trafficking of minors. And what's even more alarming is that a lot of the time, these strategies work. The public is extremely impressionable to narratives that posit the abuser as the true victim and the victim as the true abuser. Time and time again, people have been swayed by these PR campaigns. It didn't work out for Jeffrey Epstein, but it has continued to work out in favor of other men. And my hope is that by recognizing the overlap between this infamous case, people will start to recognize these tactics for what they are, an attempt to sway accountability and ensure that victims never receive the justice they deserve. Jeffrey Epstein may be dead, but some of the other men benefiting from these strategies are still alive. And it's important for people to be discerning when it comes to the narratives that are being spoon-fed to the public by these wealthy elite publicists.